This is a recording from the ECG Essentials webinar, where the first 2 steps of ECG interpretation are introduced. If you would like to know more, you can access our full 12-hour ECG Mastery course using the 40% discount code or get the free PDF guide. Find all the links below. Now, let's get started.
Right. So now we're going to look at some ECGs using the 5-step approach. The first step is to look at the rhythm, or to analyze the rhythm rather. And the reason why we analyze the rhythm is because we're curious to know where is the origin of the electrical activity. We hope it's from the SA node because that's the natural cardiac pacemaker, but sometimes it's not, right? And there we also further describe the rhythm by commenting on its regularity and its rate. Then the next step is to look at the P wave. Remember, the P wave represents atrial depolarization. And so we can spot any abnormalities involving the atria. Also, by looking at the P wave, we're able to further specify the origin of a supraventricular rhythm. And I'll get to that in a minute. And then the next step is to look at the PR interval, which by extension represents the movement of electrical activity between atria and ventricles. And if we want to know if there's abnormal transmission of electricity between atria and ventricles, we look at the PR interval. Next, we look at the QRS complex. Remember, it represents ventricular depolarization. So here we're in the territory of ventricles. So we're looking for any abnormalities involving the ventricles. We're talking about hypertrophy, whether the ventricular wall is being perfused, so ischemia, infarction, etc. And that applies more specifically to the ST segment and T wave component of which by extension represents ventricular repolarization. Okay, so now we're going to start at step 1. Analyzing the rhythm. The process of analyzing rhythm requires you to comment on regularity. Is the rhythm regular or irregular? The complex width, is it narrow or wide? And the heart rate, is it a normal cardia, so between 60 and 100? A bradycardia, or is it a tachy? So is it slow or is it fast? So let's start with regularity. So if we point out our QRS complexes, as I've done here with an arrow, you can see that the spacing between the arrows is more or less the same. And when the interval between complexes is the same, we call this a regular rhythm. The next example, if we look at the spaces between our arrows, they are not the same. This space is much bigger than this one, and the next one is much bigger than both of the previous spaces, etc., etc. Okay, and this is an example of an irregular rhythm. And then sometimes it's not that easy to spot regularity or irregularity. And so sometimes you may want to mark 3 or 4 complexes on a piece of paper and then move your piece of paper along the rhythm strip to see whether the piece of paper or your markings overlap with the complexes, as they do in this case. And that is why it is a regular rhythm. Okay, I want to quickly further specify this second example here. We actually call it an irregular rhythm, and that's because there is no discernible pattern that one can observe here. Whereas sometimes you can see the complexes are paired or they come in triplets, right? And that would be referred to as a regularly irregular rhythm. So the next part of analyzing the rhythm is to look at the complex width. Is it narrow or is it wide? Basic principles. Narrow complexes suggest a supraventricular origin. Okay, so the origin of the electrical activity is coming from above the ventricles, right? And how do we know that the complex is narrow? Is because it measures less than 120 milliseconds. Oh, sorry, I didn't highlight. Moving forward, all the ECGs that we're going to be looking at, we're going to assume that they're calibrated at 25 millimeters per second. And for that reason, we can then say 120 milliseconds is equivalent to 3 small blocks, okay? And so if your complex is less than 3 small blocks, we call it a narrow complex, which suggests it has a supraventricular origin. However, like there, sorry, I forgot about that animation. However, if you have a broad complex, a complex that is more than 3 small blocks, that suggests to us a ventricular origin of the electrical activity. This is not entirely true. You'll find that throughout the webinar, from now on, I'm going to be making statements which I will then later retract because it was a half truth. And so for now, just take it at face value. If you have a broad complex, the origin of the electrical activity is most likely from the ventricles. This is not always true, and I'll get to that later. Okay, so here we're analyzing rhythms, right? Remember? And we've already commented on the regularity. And now we want to comment on the width of the QRS complexes. So in this first example, the QRS complex measures about 2 small blocks. And so we say it's 80 milliseconds and it's less than 120. So it's a narrow complex. Okay. This next example, it measures about 1.5 small blocks. So it measures about 60 milliseconds. And so it's less than 120 milliseconds. So this is also another narrow complex rhythm. And then the last example here, the complex is really wide, and we say it measures about 320 milliseconds. And so this is a broad complex. So bigger picture, we're saying this implies that the origin is from above the ventricles, also above the ventricles for the second one. And this here suggests that the origin of the electrical activity is coming from within the ventricles. Then the last part is to comment on the heart rate. To calculate the heart rate, I think it's best to look at your rhythm strip, count the number of complexes that you can see within your rhythm strip, and then multiply it by the appropriate number. And why do I say appropriate number? Is because it depends on how long your rhythm strip is. And because our ECG is calibrated at 25 millimeters per second, our rhythm strips are 10 seconds long. And so we would then multiply by 6, because 10 times 6 is 60 seconds, which is 1 minute. So we count the number of complexes here, and we find in the first example that there are a total of 18 complexes. Remember, a QRS complex represents ventricular depolarization, which by extension represents ventricular contraction, which is the heartbeat. Okay, so we can count here and we see, oh, we have 18 ventricular contractions in 10 seconds. So the question then is, how many do we have in 60 seconds? So we times that by 6, and then we get 108. And so here, this is an example of a regular, narrow, complex tachycardia of 108 beats per minute. We'll do the same for the next rhythm. Count the number of complexes in our 10-second rhythm strip, and then times that by 6. And then we also have another tachycardia of 102 beats per minute. And we also do the exact same for the last. We find that we have about 24 complexes, times that by 6, and we have another tachycardia of 144 beats per minute. So all in all, when you look at this ECG rhythm strip for the first one, you would describe the rhythm as a regular, narrow, complex tachycardia of 108 beats per minute. The second one is an irregular, narrow, complex tachycardia of 102 beats per minute. And the last one is a regular, broad, complex tachycardia of 144 beats per minute. Now, this sounds really nice and professional and well put together if you were to describe the rhythm to someone over the phone. But the question then is, do you actually understand what it is that you're saying? We'll look at each example individually. Because we're saying it's a regular, narrow, complex tachycardia, what are we saying? We're saying it's narrow. That implies to us that it's coming from above the ventricles. So maybe the electrical activity is coming from here. Put a blue dot here. And what we know is that it's firing regularly, so at equal intervals, and it's doing so fast. So maybe it's firing like that. Maybe. Okay. And then for the next example, let's do the same. It's a narrow complex. Okay. So it's coming from above the ventricles. We don't know where, but maybe here now. Okay. It's firing irregular, and it's also doing so fast. Okay. So maybe it's like that. Maybe. So based on the information we have so far, this is what we can say, or what we can infer from what we have said in terms of the rhythm. But this is not true for this particular rhythm strip, but we'll get to that when we go to the next step. And then for the next example, this is a regular broad complex tachy. So we say it's broad, implying that it has a ventricular origin. So there's our origin. Maybe it's there. And it's firing regularly, and it's doing so fast. So maybe that's what's happening here. Okay. All right. So does someone want to comment just to remind us, what are the 3 things we look at when analyzing the rhythm? Okay. Yeah. So regularity, complex width, and heart rate. That's correct. So all 3. So now we've looked at the rhythm. Now we're going to look at the P wave. We look at the P wave to help us further specify the origin of our supraventricular rhythm, because for now we can just say it's coming from above the ventricles. That's it. And looking at the P wave also helps us spot any abnormalities of the atria, which I won't cover now in this step because we looked at that when we spoke about the different morphologies that one can find when looking at the P wave. When looking at the P wave, you comment on also 3 things. The first is the location. Is there a P wave preceding every complex? The axis, is the P wave axis normal? The P wave axis is not the same as cardiac axis. It's different. And then morphology. Are the P waves normal? So we're talking about those morphologies. We got P pulmonale, mitrale before. And are they consistent? In the same rhythm strip, does the P wave look the same? Okay. So let's start with location. In a normal sinus rhythm, you would expect the P wave to precede the curious complex because the atria depolarizes first. Via the AV node, there's a small little pause, and then the electrical activity or impulse is sent off to the ventricles. So the P precedes the QRS. That's what we would expect in a normal heart, in a normal sinus rhythm. But in a junctional rhythm, so the electrical activity starting here in the middle between atria and ventricle, the P can precede the QRS complex, it can follow it, or you may not have any P waves at all. They can be overshadowed by the QRS complex. And then if you have a ventricular rhythm, you won't see P waves. And if there is a heart block at the level of the AV node, right, you would expect a bigger gap between the P wave and the QRS complex because the heart block is impeding the flow of electricity from atria to ventricles. And so now I've left step 1 on screen, which was analyzing the rhythm. Now we're going to look at the P waves. We start with location. If we look here, there's a P wave before every single one of our complexes. Here's the P wave, here's one, followed by a complex, there's another, there's a complex, there's another, there's a complex. Here we can say there's a normal P wave location. How about this P wave location? So here, instead of P waves, we don't have P waves. We actually have these waves here. These are known as fibrillatory waves. So there's no P waves, but they're fibrillatory waves instead. Before, in the previous section, what we said was that because it's narrow, it has a supraventricular origin, it's firing irregularly, and it's doing so fast. So earlier, we made this specific animation to represent that. But that's actually not true. That's more in keeping with like a sinus arrhythmia. It's not representative of atrial fibrillation. What's happening in atrial fibrillation is that instead of the atria depolarizing, there's disorganized electrical activity within the atria. Remember, if the atria depolarizes, the atria contract. In atrial fibrillation, there's disorganized electrical activity, which doesn't depolarize the atria that well, and instead the atria quivers. And then, so that's more of an accurate representation, this quivering of this blue dot here, and then some electrical activity being sent off to the ventricles, causing a ventricular response. So that's atrial fibrillation. And in this case, it's a fast atrial fibrillation. So that's atrial fibrillation with a rapid ventricular response. And then in the last example, this is a ventricular rhythm with the broad complexes. And so there are no P waves here. And that's expected. Remember, as we discussed earlier on, with ventricular rhythms, you expect not to see P waves. The next part of looking at the P waves is to comment on the P wave axis. Is it normal? So what is the P wave axis? Basically, we're interested to know the general direction of the electrical activity in the atria. And if we think about it, the electricity, if it's coming from the sinoatrial node, moves in this general direction shown by the arrow. And then if we include our hexaxial reference system or our Cabrera system, you can see that in the atria, it's moving towards lead 2 and away from AVR, right? And so when looking at the P wave, you'd expect a positive P wave in lead 2 and then a negative P wave or upside down P wave in AVR. I'm going to remove these last two rhythm strips because they don't have P waves. And so we're just going to look at the first one, right? And this is the 12 lead ECG for this first one. And we can see here in lead 2, the P wave is positive, and we can see there in lead AVR, it's negative. Right. What we can say now is that it has a normal P wave location and it also has a normal P wave axis. Then the last thing we comment on is the morphology. Is the morphology of the P wave normal? And is it consistent? Does it look the same throughout the rhythm strip? And if we highlight our P waves here again, what we can see here anyways is that the P wave looks more or less the same throughout the rhythm strip. And also what we can say is that the morphology, or you can trust me rather, is that the morphology is normal. I didn't zoom in for you to confirm that it is in fact less than 2.5 millimeters in height, but you can take my word for it that the morphology here is also normal. So why is consistency important? So when the P wave looks the same throughout the rhythm strip, what that implies to us is that the origin of the electrical activity is coming from the same spot, wherever that may be. Okay. And if the P wave changes, it implies that the origin changes with each atrial contraction. So here, what we can conclude now is that it's a narrow complex coming from above the ventricle. It's firing regularly and it's doing so fast. And what we can also conclude is that it's coming from the sinoatrial node. Why? Because the location, it's preceding every complex, its axis, it's positive in lead 2, negative in AVR, and the morphology is consistent. So now we can say it's a sinus tachycardia. Before, when we just had our rhythm strip and we didn't look at our 12-lead ECG to comment on the axis, you can't say with confidence that the origin of your rhythm is the sinoatrial node. Okay, so this is an example of sinus tachycardia. Here, does someone want to write in the chat the rhythm, their analysis of this rhythm? Like we did earlier on, we said it was a regular narrow complex tachycardia. How would you describe this particular rhythm that's on screen? We can do it in pieces if you'd prefer. Is this rhythm regular or irregular? Okay, it's irregular, okay, and it's irregularly irregular. Are the complexes narrow or wide? Okay, they're narrow. Okay, that's right. And lastly, a normal cardia, tachycardia or bradycardia. Again, it's a 25 millimeters per second. It's calibrated. It's a 10-second rhythm strip. It's a tachycardia. That's correct. So here for our rhythm analysis, we describe it as an irregularly irregular, narrow complex tachycardia of 102 beats per minute. Okay. Now we're going to go on to the P waves. Is the P wave location normal? Yes or no? So the question is there a P wave before every single QRS complex? Yes or no? No, that's correct. Why? Because there's no P wave there, no P wave there, and no P wave there. Okay. Now, this is me repeating myself. I was lazy. So all the ECGs you see on screen, I actually drew them. And so I didn't go and draw the 12 lead for this particular ECG. But does someone want to comment on the axis? Because I did label this particular lead as lead 2, the rhythm strips of lead 2. And so we have half the information anyways. We don't have AVR, of course. But does someone want to comment on the axis? Is it normal or abnormal based on the information we have? You say the axis is normal? Okay. I'd actually say the axis is abnormal, right? Why? Because if you look here, the second P wave, okay, axis, I said abnormal axis, second P wave here, it's upside down, right? And you shouldn't be getting upside down P waves or negative P waves in lead 2. Remember, it should be positive in lead 2. And we have other ones that are upside down there. And the last observation, sorry, I put it on screen, I revealed the answer, was that the morphology isn't consistent. It's changing. The P wave isn't always the same. And so now what is this telling us? This is telling us that the origin of the electrical activity, it's kind of like jumping around, right? It's not in the same focus or the same spot. So what we're saying is here is that it's a narrow complex. It's coming from above the ventricles. It's firing irregularly. It's doing so fast. And because the P wave location and the axis are abnormal, we know that it's not coming from the sinoatrial node and it's changing morphology, meaning it's jumping around above the ventricles. Yeah. So maybe it looks like that. It ends up looking like that. Okay. And this specifically is known as a multifocal atrial tachycardia. And earlier on, we actually mentioned a slower version of this when we spoke about the conduction system. Does someone want to remind me, what was that condition called? It's similar to this, but it's just the slower version. This one, multifocal atrial tachycardia, is when the heart rate's more than 100. And then if it's less than 100, it's known as something else. We did mention it earlier. It's when I spoke about what could go wrong when we looked at the conduction system. Anyone? Okay, so that was a wandering atrial pacemaker. So we spoke about wandering atrial pacemaker earlier on. I don't think I'll find the slide. Maybe I will. There we go, somewhere here. There we go. Wandering atrial pacemaker. So that's the slower version of a multifocal atrial tachycardia. Right. Let me find my way back. Here we go. Okay. So does anyone want to remind us, what are the 3 things that we comment on when looking at the P wave? Yep, that's right. The location, access, and morphology.
Okay. Thanks for watching. We hope you find the content covered in this section helpful. If you'd like part 2, like this video and comment below. Get the free guide or take the full course.